Hey everyone, so today I'll be talking about Title IX and transgender athletes and the conflict between Title IX and transgenders in athletics nowadays. It's become a really prevalent issue. And so I thought it'd be something interesting to talk about, especially with the way that athletics is kind of heading in our generation. Especially myself being a student athlete and kind of how it affects us, but obviously looking at it from an unbiased perspective and from our disciplinaries that we're currently majoring here in university studies. So before diving into this topic, I had to define what certain terminology was talking about this topic just because it is a sensitive subject. Referring to people the right way, it's just going to really help you understand what it's all about. Title IX is an education amendment that prohibits sex discrimination in any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And then transgenders are people that have a gender identity or gender expression that differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. And so throughout my paper and throughout the presentation, the common theme was that it was people mostly have an issue with male to female transgenders than it being female to male transgenders in the domain of athletics. And so I thought that was really interesting. And then cisgender athletes, I didn't know that there was an actual terminology used for people of this group. And so cisgender athletes relates to or being a person whose gender identity corresponds with the sex the person had or was identified as having at birth. And so I'm a cisgender female athlete. And then, yeah, so I was a girl at birth. And then I still identify as a girl to this day. So relevant disciplines. In my university studies degree, my three areas of concentration are agricultural leadership, organizational leadership, and integrative studies in health organization. And so when tackling this specific issue, I thought that ISHO and organizational leadership were great disciplines to look at the issue. So this discipline, organizational leadership, is an area of concentration that is ideal for this topic because it looks at it from an administrative and legislative point of view, which is crucial to making safe policies that cater to all groups affected by this complex issue. So there are legal, physiological, and cultural concerns related to the participation of transgender athletes. One of the articles provided physiological evidence on the conflict of transgender status and safety for athletes with whom they're competing against. So in one of my articles, there was a prime example of a transgender female MMA fighter, and that transgender male to female athlete actually caused injuries that were potentially career ending for the other person who was a cisgender female athlete. And so it was just kind of, there was conflict there. And then there was another article. So, in contrast to that, there was an example of a transgender male that was required by law to compete as a female despite taking testosterone, whereas that person, UIL, basically forced that transgender male to female to compete against girls because he had already had the gender reassignment surgery, and then because it was a girl now, he couldn't actually compete against the guys or the boys, even though that's what he wanted to do. And so he actually hurt one of the girls that he competed against and ended up winning all of the events. And so, so some of these examples illustrate the challenges of policy from an organizational perspective as Title IX. Because Title IX is an education amendment that prevents sex discrimination, and it really just questions the notion of whether or not to allow transgenders to compete with cisgender athletes, because essentially Title IX protects both parties. So they protect cisgender from sex discrimination, and then it protects transgenders from sex discrimination. So it'd be contradicting and hypocritical if Title IX ruled out one group versus the other, but it's kind of contradicting because it's supposed to protect cisgender athletes. So yeah, I can't really rule out transgender people from competing. And so, yeah, but it poses a threat to cisgender athletes, especially the female ones who are competing against male to female transgenders. Some more things that I found interesting in my findings were that there were flaws in the policy, and so there's no actually definitive solution from this perspective of this topic, and so it's really hard to make decisions for both groups. Yep, and then it was also stated in another one of the journal articles that female category in sport is not precisely or universally established according to this article, and so it just made it really hard for organizations and policymakers to create fair rules that include transgender athletes to participate, but also still protect the integrity of women's sport and cisgender women. So for instance, I was reading an opinion piece, and states such as Mississippi, South Dakota, and Idaho have banned transgender women from competing in high school and collegiate athletics, and then they're expected to have 20 more states to follow. And so those were some of the interesting findings. So moving on. So in integrated studies in health organizations, so this is relevant because it analyzes the topic from a healthcare perspective, and it investigates the overall well-being of transgender and cisgender athletes. So with this, there wasn't a lot of research, so therefore there needs to be more research undertaken to determine if indeed there is any athletic advantage to male to female transgender athletes having a high testosterone level, because it suggests that skill and size categories are also advantages. So for instance, there was an athlete that tried to be drafted in the Australian Footballers League, and he turned out, so he was 6'1", and then he basically, that was his advantage. However, there was a cisgender female athlete that was drafted as well, and she stands at 6'6", and so he was excluded from the league, whereas she got to play, and he didn't because of his size when the other girl was taller. So I just found that contradicting and questionable. So there was more research that states that male puberty makes you taller, confers greater muscle and bone mass, larger heart and lung capacity relative to size and more hemoglobin. And for cisgender men, this translates to roughly 6 to 10% advantage over biological women in sports such as running and swimming. Although the gap can be larger in other domains, in a few sports, female biology actually conveys some advantage. So the 6 to 10% sounds like a modest amount, but at the elite level, it only takes 1 to 2% differences that can easily make the margin of someone's victory. So contrary to this was hormonal treatment abates much of the advantage in trans women because it has scientifically proven that it reduces muscle mass, strength, and hemoglobin levels. Yet the best evidence that was found is that significant differences remain even after 3 years of hormones. Therefore, there's really uncertainty if the gap will ever close. Over a period of time, transgender female hormones become more aligned with cisgender athletes. Transgender women take the female hormone estrogen and testosterone blockers before having any surgery and continue to take estrogen after their transition. The transgender female cyclist states that there are pretty radical changes during and after hormone therapy. There is a decrease in muscle mass, strength and speed, all reduced, and also compounds aging. So that athlete herself states that there are definitive changes in her body from man to woman, but you know, who is to say that they don't have a biological advantage? So Title IX basically protects them from being ruled out. So what does the future look like? And so from my perspective of being an athlete, I think there is going to be a decline in cisgender athletes wanting to compete if there continues to be an allowance of transgender female athletes. There will be a decline in transgender opportunities to play Lack of inclusion of transgenders may lead to mental health problems. And then without common ground, people will continue to be polarized and have to choose one side of the issue or the other. There's also going to be safety concerns for cisgender athletes, long-term injuries from competing against transgender athletes, and it may even potentially become a trend and influence future generations to conform to becoming a transgender. So some of the conclusions drawn is that there is an insufficient amount of research done about this complex issue, therefore making sport policies from an organizational leadership perspective is inequitable to transgender and cisgender athletes. The same research is being used for the basis of permissible testosterone levels in athletes, and so the Olympic Committee hasn't really changed anything ruling it out. There hasn't been legislation passed by the Supreme Court, so states have been making laws, but it hasn't been legislated by a legal precedent, therefore making it difficult to find solutions that protect both societal groups. And there has to be legislation passed in order for administrators to make decisions and protect the integrity of athletics. They'll be able to make decisions based on law and fact rather than just opinions and interpretations of something. And then also another conclusion was that the female category in sport is not precisely and universally established. So yeah, that